Keanu Reeves was a man who valued peace more than anything else. Despite being one of the most famous actors in the world, he preferred quiet places where no one would recognize him. That evening, after finishing a long day of commitments, he felt the need for a calm environment where he could sit and collect his thoughts. Instead of going to a big restaurant or a fancy hotel lounge, he chose a small bar located on the edge of town. It was the kind of place where regular people came after work, where the lights were warm, the music was soft, and the atmosphere was simple. When Keanu pushed open the wooden door, the smell of roasted food and the faint sound of old songs filled the air. The bar was not crowded. A few workers sat at tables, laughing quietly over their meals. Two elderly men played cards in the corner, occasionally arguing about the rules. Behind the counter, the bartender, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, polished glasses while greeting customers with a smile. Keanu liked it instantly. It felt real, far away from the noise of Hollywood, far away from cameras and flashing lights. He stepped in wearing jeans, a dark jacket, and worn-out boots. Nothing about him screamed movie star. He had always been a man who blended in, someone who didn't rely on fame to feel important. As he sat down at the bar, he greeted the bartender politely with a small nod. She smiled back, not realizing at first who he was, and asked what he wanted. Keanu requested a simple drink and some food, nothing special. For the first time all day, he felt relaxed. Sitting there, he listened to the gentle murmur of conversations and the clinking of glasses. He watched people living ordinary lives, something he deeply admired. He always believed that real happiness came from simple moments like these, not from the glamour that surrounded his career. But peace often comes with its challenges. At a corner table, a group of men sat with heavy boots and leather jackets. Their laughter was not like the others, it was loud and sharp, cutting through the calm atmosphere. They were bikers, rough in appearance, and clearly already under the influence of several drinks. Their voices grew louder with every passing minute, their jokes turning into rude remarks that made nearby customers shift uncomfortably. At first, Keanu paid no attention. He wasn't the kind of man who got involved in other people's behavior easily. He believed in letting others be unless they crossed a line. But it didn't take long for him to notice the way the bikers treated the bartender. Each time she walked past, they made comments, laughed too loudly, and tried to pull her into their rowdy mood. She forced polite smiles, but her eyes told a different story. She was uncomfortable, though she tried to carry on with her work. Keanu sat quietly, observing. His food arrived, and he thanked the bartender kindly, which made her smile genuinely this time. Unlike the others, his presence was calm, respectful, and gentle. Yet, in the background, the bikers continued their behavior, and slowly the bar's warm atmosphere began to shift. People whispered to each other, some glanced nervously at the group, while others stared down at their tables to avoid any attention. Keanu knew moments like this well. He had seen the world enough to recognize when a situation could turn unpleasant. But he didn't want to jump to conclusions. So, he carried on eating his food, hoping the bikers would settle down on their own. Unfortunately, they didn't. Instead, their laughter grew louder, and one of them banged his fist on the table, startling the elderly men playing cards. The bartender tried to calm them by serving more drinks quickly, but that only encouraged their rowdiness. Keanu set down his fork and took a slow breath. He didn't like confrontation, but he also couldn't ignore disrespect. He believed in kindness above all, but kindness didn't mean staying silent when others were being treated poorly. He glanced toward the bartender, who avoided the biker's eyes and kept her head low. That was when Keanu decided to speak, not out of anger, but out of quiet firmness. He turned slightly in his seat, his voice steady but calm, and said, "Let's keep it respectful. She's just doing her job." The bar fell quiet for a brief moment. The bikers looked over at him, surprised that someone had spoken up. To them, he looked like an ordinary man, maybe even someone too gentle to stand up against them. They didn't recognize him as the world-famous actor, nor did they see the years of discipline hidden beneath his calm eyes. The bartender froze, worried about how the group would react. Other customers leaned forward slightly, curious but also nervous. The bikers, however, laughed at first, not taking his words seriously. One of them raised his glass and mocked, "What are you, her bodyguard?" Another added something under his breath, and the group chuckled together. Keanu didn't react. He didn't rise from his seat, nor did he raise his voice. He simply looked back at them with the same calm expression. He wasn't trying to provoke, he was only standing up for respect. His silence was more powerful than words, and it made the bikers feel uneasy. They weren't used to someone facing them without fear or anger. The bartender quickly tried to move past the moment by asking if anyone wanted refills, but the tension lingered in the air. Keanu returned to his food, showing no sign of worry, as though nothing had happened. But the bikers, still unsettled, whispered among themselves. They had noticed something different about this man, something they couldn't quite understand. The rest of the customers continued with their meals, but everyone was quietly aware that the night had taken a turn. Some admired Keanu's courage, while others worried about what the bikers might do next. For Keanu, however, the choice was simple. He had always lived by one principle: treat people with dignity. Fame didn't matter, appearances didn't matter, what mattered was humanity. And in that quiet bar, surrounded by strangers who didn't know his story, he had shown exactly that through a simple sentence. The night wasn't over, and Keanu could sense that the bikers weren't finished. But for now, he leaned back slightly, took another sip of his drink, and focused on the peaceful parts of the room: the soft music, the laughter of friends at the far table, the smile of the bartender who silently appreciated his kindness. It was a fragile peace, one that could break at any moment, but Keanu Reeves was a man who had learned to carry calmness even in the middle of storms. The bar had returned to its rhythm, but under the surface, something had shifted. Keanu Reeves remained seated at the counter, eating slowly, not showing any concern on his face. Yet he could sense the stares from the corner of the room where the bikers sat. They were not used to being told to calm down. To them, it felt like a challenge, and men like them did not like being corrected by a stranger. Keanu had always been the kind of man who stayed in the background, blending into a crowd, unnoticed. But that night, his calm voice had put him in the center of attention. The bartender moved nervously around, trying to avoid the bikers' table, and the other customers pretended to mind their own business, though their eyes kept drifting to the corner where the tension grew thicker. The bikers whispered among themselves, their laughter returning but now with a sharper edge. Every few minutes, one of them glanced toward Keanu, as if trying to measure him. He didn't look like a threat. He wore no fancy clothes, carried no tough expression, and sat in perfect stillness. To them, he looked like any other man who could be intimidated. That thought alone made them more restless. Meanwhile, Keanu focused on his meal. He wasn't there to impress anyone, nor to create trouble. He had come for peace, and he intended to keep it that way. But peace, he knew, was fragile when ego filled the air. He had learned that lesson many times in life, not from movies, not from scripts, but from real experience. The bartender, grateful for his earlier words, quietly set another glass in front of him, saying, "This one's on the house." Keanu gave her a small smile, a gesture that spoke more than words. She didn't say it, but her eyes carried thanks. Still, the unease lingered. The bikers didn't let the moment go. Their voices carried across the room, filled with remarks aimed at making others uncomfortable. One of them tapped his glass loudly against the table, drawing attention. Another made a dramatic laugh at something unfunny, hoping to catch Keanu's reaction. But Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't even turn around. He had a unique strength, the ability to remain steady when others tried to shake him. It was the same strength that carried him through the hardest moments of his personal life, the same strength that made people admire him beyond his acting career. The customers noticed this. They began whispering to one another, impressed by the quiet man who hadn't let the group get to him. Some of them, who had felt powerless against the biker's behavior earlier, felt a sense of hope. Maybe things would be different tonight. Maybe the bikers wouldn't control the entire bar after all. The bikers, however, weren't ready to let go. One of them stood up, pretending to stretch, and walked past Keanu's chair. He slowed his steps, waiting to see if the man at the counter would react. Keanu simply moved his drink slightly to make room, showing no fear but also no hostility. It was an act of courtesy, as though nothing unusual was happening. The biker smirked and went back to his table. His friends laughed, though there was something nervous in their laughter. They didn't understand this man. Most people either reacted with anger or shrank back in fear. But this stranger did neither. He was calm in a way that made them uncomfortable, as if he knew something they didn't. The bartender leaned closer to Keanu as she passed by, speaking in a low voice so only he could hear. "You don't have to get involved. They cause trouble sometimes, but they usually leave after a while." Keanu nodded softly, appreciating her concern. "Don't worry," he replied in his usual gentle tone. "I'm just here for the food." And that was true. He had no interest in making himself a hero. He wasn't in a movie, he was in real life, and real life was about making wise choices, not dramatic ones. Yet, wisdom sometimes meant standing firm without raising your voice. The bikers, still restless, started teasing the older men playing cards. They leaned over their table, laughing at their game, making it impossible for them to continue. The elderly men exchanged uneasy glances, not daring to say anything. The whole bar grew silent again, waiting to see how things would unfold. Keanu noticed, of course. He had sharp eyes, always observing. He set his fork down and turned slightly, speaking just loud enough to be heard, "Let them play. They're not bothering anyone." His words were calm, not aggressive, but they carried weight. The bikers froze for a moment, surprised again. The elderly men looked at him with relief, as if someone had just given them back their dignity. The biker nearest to him narrowed his eyes, clearly frustrated. "Why do you care?" he asked, his voice carrying across the bar. Keanu didn't rush to answer. He looked at the man for a moment, then replied softly, "Because respect matters." The sentence was simple, but it echoed through the bar. People sat straighter, watching intently. The bikers, on the other hand, exchanged glances, their confidence shaking slightly. They had expected resistance in the form of anger or fear, but not this. Still, pride wouldn't let them back down easily. They whispered again, planning their next move, determined not to lose face in front of the small audience around them. One of them tapped his foot impatiently, while another drummed his fingers on the table. The energy in the room grew heavier, as if the walls themselves were waiting for what might happen next. But Keanu, as always, remained steady. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a scene. He simply sat with the quiet dignity that had always defined him, letting the weight of his presence speak louder than any threat could. Outside the bar, the night was calm. The stars glimmered, the wind brushed softly against the trees, and the world carried on without knowing what small story was unfolding inside that dimly lit room. But inside, all eyes stayed on one man who seemed to hold peace in his very posture. The bikers didn't know who he was. To them, he was just another face, another stranger. They didn't realize that the man they were trying to intimidate had trained for years in martial arts, that he had performed countless action scenes with precision and discipline, or that he had built a life based on patience, humility, and strength. To the people in that bar, however, he was slowly becoming something more than a stranger. He was becoming a quiet example, a reminder that standing up for respect didn't always require shouting or aggression. Sometimes, it only required a steady voice and the courage to speak when others remained silent. The bikers leaned back in their chairs, still plotting, still unsettled. The night was not over, and the tension had only begun to grow. But for now, the room belonged to Keanu's calm presence, and everyone felt it. The bartender wiped down the counter, her hands shaking less now. The elderly men returned to their card game, encouraged by the words spoken on their behalf. And the rest of the customers, though they pretended to go back to their meals, couldn't help but glance at the quiet man at the bar, the man who had changed the entire energy of the room without raising his hand. The bikers thought they had found an easy target. But they didn't yet know who they were dealing with. The night moved on, but the atmosphere inside the bar didn't return to normal. Every clink of a glass, every shuffle of cards, every laugh felt quieter than usual, as if the whole place was waiting for something to happen. People pretended to focus on their own tables, but their eyes often wandered toward Keanu and the group of bikers. Keanu stayed exactly as he had been, calm, steady, and collected. He wasn't a man who enjoyed drawing attention, but it seemed as though the night had chosen him to be at the center of it. He had finished his food, and his drink sat nearly untouched in front of him. Every now and then, he glanced around the room, not out of worry, but simply out of habit. He liked noticing details: the way the card players tapped their fingers when nervous, the way the bartender kept glancing toward the corner, the way the bikers' laughter carried a restless edge. The bikers, on the other hand, grew more unsettled with every passing moment. They had tried their usual tricks: loud laughter, sharp comments, intimidating stares, but nothing seemed to shake this man at the counter. They couldn't understand why. Most people either avoided them or tried to make peace by joining their rowdy behavior. But this stranger neither joined nor avoided. He simply stayed calm, like a rock in the middle of a restless river. That calmness bothered them more than open defiance ever would. One of the bikers leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on Keanu. "He thinks he's better than us," he muttered to his friends, though his words carried loud enough for others to hear. The others nodded, whispering back and forth, their voices low but their eyes sharp. Keanu didn't answer. He wasn't interested in proving himself to anyone. He simply shifted slightly in his seat, resting his arm on the counter, showing no sign that their words had reached him. The bartender, sensing the tension growing, tried to break the silence by turning up the music slightly. A soft tune filled the air, but it did little to ease the unease. The bikers were restless, and the customers were anxious. Even the card game slowed down, the older men hesitating with each move. Finally, one of the bikers stood up. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried the kind of confidence that came from being feared in most places he entered. He walked slowly toward the bar, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. The whole room seemed to hold its breath. He stopped beside Keanu's chair, leaned against the counter, and gave him a long, searching look. "You've got a lot to say for someone sitting alone," he said, his voice low but firm. Keanu turned his head slightly to meet the man's eyes. His expression didn't change, it remained calm, thoughtful, and steady. "I didn't say much," he replied softly. "Just asked for respect." The biker let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Respect, huh? You think you can teach us about respect?" Keanu didn't raise his voice, didn't frown, didn't show any irritation. He simply answered, "Everyone deserves it." "Even her," he added, nodding toward the bartender who had been silently wiping the counter a few feet away. The biker glanced at the bartender, then back at Keanu. For a moment, he didn't respond. The silence between them stretched long enough that people at other tables stopped even pretending to mind their own business. They stared openly, waiting for what would happen next. Finally, the biker leaned closer, lowering his voice but still making sure others could hear. "You're not from around here, are you?" Keanu shook his head slightly. "Just passing through." "Then maybe you should keep quiet. You don't know us." Keanu gave a small nod, acknowledging the words. "You're right," he said calmly. "I don't know you. But I know that kindness never hurts anyone." The biker straightened, blinking as though unsure how to respond. His friends at the corner table laughed, trying to push him forward, but something about Keanu's tone unsettled him. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't fear. It was something else, something he couldn't put into words. After a pause, he turned back toward his group, shaking his head as if dismissing the conversation. But his expression gave him away. He wasn't satisfied. The others at the table whispered again, glancing back at the counter. The night was far from over. The bartender let out a quiet sigh of relief as the man walked away. She leaned slightly toward Keanu and whispered, "You should be careful. They don't like being challenged." Keanu gave her a reassuring smile. "It's all right," he said simply. Minutes passed, but the bikers couldn't let go. They raised their voices again, telling exaggerated stories of their adventures, laughing too loudly, making sure their presence filled every corner of the bar. Still, every time they laughed, their eyes flicked back toward Keanu, as though checking if he reacted. He didn't. His stillness became louder than their noise. The other customers noticed this too. A quiet respect began to form around the man at the counter. He hadn't done anything dramatic, but his calm strength gave them comfort. They began to feel that maybe the bikers didn't control the room after all. Finally, unable to resist any longer, one of the bikers walked over again. This time, he didn't stand beside Keanu, he stood directly in front of him, blocking his view of the counter. "You think you're tough, don't you?" he asked, his tone challenging. Keanu looked up, his expression as steady as ever. "No," he answered honestly. "I just believe in treating people right." The biker frowned. That wasn't the response he expected. He leaned closer, trying to intimidate. "You keep talking like that, people might think you're some kind of hero." Keanu gave a small, almost invisible smile. "I'm not a hero," he said softly. "Just a man who likes peace." The words hung in the air. The biker studied him for a moment longer, then scoffed and returned to his table. His friends laughed, but this time, their laughter sounded forced, uneasy. The customers exchanged glances. They could see what was happening. The bikers were trying again and again to break the calm stranger, but nothing worked. And with each failed attempt, it became clearer that the power in the room was shifting not to the bikers, but to the man who sat quietly, refusing to be shaken. The bartender, watching closely, couldn't help but feel admiration. She had seen many men come through the bar, loud men, strong men, reckless men, but very few carried the quiet strength of this stranger. It wasn't about fists or shouting. It was about presence, about the way he seemed unmovable no matter what was thrown at him. The bikers still whispered and plotted, but a small seed of doubt had begun to grow among them. They didn't know who this man was, but they were beginning to realize he wasn't ordinary. And while they laughed loudly and raised their glasses, their eyes betrayed something else, curiosity mixed with unease. The night had reached a point where everyone in the bar knew something bigger was coming. The air was heavy, every word charged with meaning. Keanu finished his drink, set the glass down carefully, and looked toward the group. Not with anger, not with challenge, but with a quiet knowing. The bikers had no idea who they were testing. To them, he was just a stranger. But to the rest of the world, he was Keanu Reeves, the man who had become a symbol of resilience both on and off screen. And though he had no intention of proving it, the night was slowly pushing him toward a moment where his true nature would shine. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, though to everyone inside the bar, time felt heavier than usual. The bikers had gone from noisy laughter to restless silence, their energy shifting between unease and stubborn pride. They had spent most of the night trying to unsettle the quiet man at the counter, but no matter what they said or did, he remained calm. That calmness was not just unusual, it was powerful. It was the kind of calm that made people wonder what was hidden beneath it. Keanu had not moved much. He sat on the same stool, his hands resting lightly on the counter, his posture relaxed. He looked like a man who had nowhere else to be, and yet, his presence commanded the room in a way no loud voice could. The bartender had noticed it, the card players had noticed it, and even the bikers, though they tried to deny it, had noticed it. The leader of the group, bigger, louder, and more stubborn than the rest, finally slammed his glass down on the table, making the sound echo across the room. "I don't like him," he muttered, his voice carrying just enough for others to hear. His friends nodded in agreement, though their nods were slower now, as if uncertainty lingered in their minds. He stood up, brushing off his jacket, and walked toward the bar with deliberate steps. This time, his friends didn't laugh. They leaned back in their chairs, watching closely, their eyes sharp with expectation. The customers held their breath. The bartender froze, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. The man stopped right beside Keanu and looked down at him. "You think you're better than us?" he asked, his tone sharp. Keanu turned his head slightly, meeting his gaze with steady eyes. His voice was quiet, but it carried clearly. "No," he said simply. "I don't think I'm better than anyone. I just believe in respect." The leader frowned, unsettled by the lack of fear. He had expected defensiveness, or maybe even apology. But what he received was something that didn't fit into the usual patterns of confrontation. He leaned closer. "Respect has to be earned," he said, his words laced with challenge. Keanu didn't blink. "It's earned by how you treat others," he replied softly. The silence that followed was heavier than the loudest shout. The other bikers shifted in their seats, waiting to see what their leader would do. The bartender glanced between them nervously, ready to step in but knowing she couldn't. The leader let out a short laugh, though it sounded more forced than natural. "You've got a smart mouth for someone sitting alone," he said, trying to reclaim control of the moment. Keanu didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up his glass, took a small sip, and set it back down. Then he looked at the man again, calm as ever. "I'm not here for a fight," he said. "I came for a quiet night. That's all." The words were simple, but they held strength. There was no fear, no aggression, only certainty. And that certainty made the leader hesitate. He wasn't used to people like this. Most men either backed down or exploded when pushed. But this man, this stranger, did neither. The rest of the bar felt the tension rising, like a string pulled too tight. Every second stretched longer, every breath seemed louder. Even the card players stopped pretending to shuffle their deck. They stared openly now, their eyes flicking back and forth between the two men. The leader, unwilling to lose face in front of his friends, leaned even closer, his shadow falling over Keanu. "So, what happens if I don't give you that quiet night?" he asked, his voice low, his words sharp. Keanu's expression didn't change. His reply was steady, measured, almost gentle. "Then it says more about you than it does about me." For a moment, the leader froze. The words hit harder than any insult could. Around the room, people exchanged quick glances. They knew what they had just witnessed. In a few simple sentences, Keanu had turned the weight of the moment back onto the man standing over him. The bartender let out a small breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The leader stepped back slightly, clearly unsettled, though he tried to hide it with a laugh. "You talk too much," he muttered, returning to his table. His friends chuckled nervously, but their eyes told a different story. They weren't laughing at Keanu, they were laughing to cover their unease. The tension in the room didn't disappear, but it shifted. Customers who had felt powerless earlier now sat straighter, braver somehow. The bartender moved with more confidence, no longer shrinking under the biker's presence. The card players picked up their game again, though their eyes still darted toward the counter. Keanu, as if nothing had happened, sat quietly. His glass was nearly empty now, and he pushed his plate aside. He didn't look proud, he didn't look triumphant. He looked exactly as he had when he entered, peaceful, humble, present. But the bikers weren't finished. Pride wouldn't let them walk away. They whispered again, their voices low and sharp. The leader's hands clenched on the table, his jaw tight. He had been challenged, and though the challenge wasn't physical, it had cut deeper. One of his friends tried to lighten the mood with another loud story, but the leader waved him off. His eyes were fixed on the quiet man at the bar. He wanted to prove something, but he couldn't quite decide how. The calm stranger had already taken control of the night without raising a hand. The bartender noticed this too. She leaned closer to Keanu when she had the chance, her voice low and filled with worry. "They won't let it go," she said softly. "They're the kind who don't like being challenged." Keanu gave her a small smile, his eyes warm. "It'll be all right," he reassured her. His voice carried no doubt, no fear. The rest of the night carried on in this fragile balance. The bikers stayed restless, their pride keeping them at their table, their eyes never far from the counter. The customers remained watchful, their meals forgotten, their focus fixed on the quiet drama unfolding before them. And Keanu sat with the same calm, steady presence he had carried since the beginning. He didn't seek the spotlight, but it found him anyway. In a room full of noise, his silence spoke the loudest. The leader knew the night wasn't finished. He could feel it in his chest, in the stares of his friends, in the way the room no longer belonged to him. And though he didn't understand it, deep down, he realized something he would never admit: the stranger had already won. The air inside the bar felt thick, almost heavy with tension. Everyone knew the night was reaching its peak. The bikers had tried all their usual tactics to provoke the quiet stranger, but nothing had worked. Their voices were louder, their stares sharper, but it was clear that they were the ones unsettled, not him. Keanu Reeves sat at the counter as if he belonged there, steady and calm, as though the noise around him couldn't touch his peace. The bartender kept glancing at him with quiet worry, while the other customers whispered among themselves. Some admired his composure, others wondered what would happen if the bikers pushed too far. The leader of the group leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Keanu. He tapped his glass slowly, his mind caught between pride and doubt. His friends waited for his move, unsure whether to push further or let the night end. For them, it wasn't just about a stranger anymore, it was about their reputation in the bar, about whether people would still see them as the toughest ones in the room. Finally, the leader stood again, this time moving slower, more cautious. He walked toward the counter, and everyone's eyes followed him. The bartender froze, her hands trembling slightly as she set down a glass. The card players stopped mid-game. The whole bar seemed to hold its breath. He stopped beside Keanu and studied him closely. There was no smirk this time, no mocking laugh. His expression was serious, almost confused. "You don't scare easy, do you?" he asked. Keanu turned his head, his gaze steady, and shook it gently. "Fear doesn't solve anything," he said softly. The leader let out a slow exhale, his shoulders loosening just slightly. "Most people don't talk to us like that," he admitted, his voice quieter than before. Keanu gave a small nod. "Maybe most people don't want trouble. But trouble usually stops when respect begins." The words hung in the air, echoing louder than the music in the background. The leader looked at him for a long moment, as though trying to understand him. His friends at the table waited, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Finally, instead of answering, The leader gave a short nod of his own. He turned, walked back to his table, and sat down heavily. His friends looked at him with surprise, whispering questions, but he didn't respond. For the first time that night, the bikers were quiet. The entire bar seemed to exhale at once. The customers relaxed, conversations started again, and the atmosphere slowly returned to what it had been before. The card players resumed their game, the bartender moved with steadier hands, and the nervous whispers faded into normal chatter. Keanu finished the last sip of his drink and set the glass down gently. He didn't smile in victory, didn't boast, didn't act as though he had won anything. He simply sat in quiet reflection, grateful that the night had found peace without turning darker. The bartender leaned over and whispered softly, "Thank you." Keanu looked at her kindly and shook his head. "No need," he replied. "I only said what was right." She gave him a warm smile, one that spoke of gratitude beyond words. For her, and for many others in that bar, his presence had changed the night. What could have been a memory of discomfort and fear became a story of calm strength and dignity. The bikers, though still restless, no longer tried to disturb anyone. They sat in their corner, quieter now, their pride wounded but their anger tempered by confusion. They didn't understand what had happened, but they knew one thing: they had met someone different. Keanu stood from his stool, placed money on the counter, and thanked the bartender for her service. His movements were unhurried, his manner respectful. As he turned to leave, the room grew quiet once more, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was out of quiet admiration. He walked toward the door, and as he pushed it open, the cool night air greeted him. The stars stretched across the sky, and the soft sounds of the town carried in the distance. He stepped outside, his boots crunching lightly on the gravel, and the door closed behind him. Inside the bar, people began talking all at once. Some asked each other if they had recognized him, others debated about who he might be. A few whispered the name that floated in the back of their minds: Keanu Reeves? Could it really have been him? The man from the movies, the one who played John Wick, sitting quietly in their little bar? The bartender shook her head with a smile. She knew who he was now, but she also knew that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was how he had carried himself, not as a celebrity, not as a character, but as a man who believed in kindness and respect. The bikers remained quiet, their leader staring at the counter where Keanu had sat. He didn't speak, but deep inside, something had shifted. For the first time in a long while, he had been faced with someone who didn't fight him, didn't fear him, and didn't try to be louder than him. Instead, he had been faced with someone who showed strength through silence and dignity. And though he would never admit it out loud, he respected that. Outside, Keanu walked down the quiet street, his hands in his pockets, his steps unhurried. He had no interest in the whispers left behind. For him, the night was simple. He had come for peace, and he had found it not in the way he expected, but in the way it was meant to be. His life had taught him many lessons, but perhaps the greatest was that true strength was not in fists or fame, but in the ability to remain calm when the world tried to shake you. That night was another reminder of that truth. Back in the bar, the story of the quiet stranger would live on. People would tell it again and again, how a group of bikers had tried to unsettle a man they didn't know, only to discover that calmness could be stronger than noise. Some would add details, some would exaggerate, but the heart of the story would remain. One man, sitting quietly, had changed the energy of an entire room. The bartender, as she closed up later that night, thought about the words he had said: "Respect matters." They were simple, but they were enough to shift everything. She smiled to herself, knowing she would carry that line with her for a long time. And so the night ended, not with a fight, not with broken glass or raised voices, but with a quiet lesson. The bikers had walked in thinking they controlled the room, but they walked out realizing that true control belonged to the one who didn't need to prove anything at all. Keanu Reeves had left as quietly as he had entered, blending back into the night. And though most of the people in the bar would never see him again, they would remember him. Not as a movie star, not as John Wick, but as a man who showed them that sometimes, the greatest power is peace itself.